Good morning from Bloomberg's office in San Francisco. This is Apple This Week. I'm Alex Webb.
I'm Mark Gurman.
We're going to be talking through one particular topic this week, a story we had towards the end of last week about Apple's efforts in drones and how that's helping their mapping, their push into mapping. But we'd love to hear any questions that you guys have. We are live on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Bloomberg.com/technology. But please send us any questions you have via the Facebook Live page. We'll do our utmost to answer them for you. But for now, let's dig into this drones topic. Mark, maybe let's talk through some of the most salient points.
Right, so just to step back a bit, I mean, as we all know, Apple Maps launched in 2012 with the iPhone 5 to a plethora of problems. They had places at the wrong address, they had airports in the middle of lakes, all sorts of issues. But year after year, they've sort of improved it. It's gotten a bit better, but it's still nowhere near as accurate and reliable as Google's Maps app on the iPhone, the web, and Android and whatnot. So they're taking a new approach to collecting data. The reason there have been so many problems is because the data hasn't been reliable, hasn't been updated quick enough. Now, they've been driving around these trucks, as you might have seen on the road, these big gray, black, or white, or red minivans, and these cars have cameras on top, and they actually go around collecting data. So Apple figured, hey, how can we do this faster, more cost-effective? So they decided to turn to drones. So now they're, going to start flying around drones around the world, and they're going to look at street signs, they're going to look at places, and get data updated much quicker, and then feed whatever's captured on the sensors and cameras on the drone to their Apple Maps teams around the world in order to update that data.
And I think it's one thing that we know that a lot of the photography, aerial photography at least, it isn't, we sit there and assume it's satellite images, and it's really not. It's actually aerial photos from drones or planes or otherwise. This kind of also moves that capability into Apple's hands, assuming it's rolled out. I think it's still quite early in their process, am I right?
Right, so earlier this year, Apple got FAA approval, an FAA exemption in order to fly drones around for data collection, map data collection purposes. Not really much past that. We don't want to give the impression that Apple's building its own drone. They're going to be using drones from some big makers like DJI. These are drones sold in an Apple store. They're under 50 pounds. That's how you get...
I mean, there was a whole bevy of drones they got approval for.
Right.
I mean, a dozen or so.
They're not really specifying
anywhere on the price spectrum.
Right. They're not specifying which they're going to use. It's possible they use one of them or they use all. I think there were about a dozen or 2 dozen different models from different drone makers.
And crucially, this exemption, this permission they were given by the FAA wasn't to, they weren't automated drones. They're not going to be armies flying into the air and taking photos on their own.
Right.
They've got to be in the line of sight of a pilot, and a qualified pilot at that, qualified actual airplane pilot. And that's the thing they're going to be allowed to do. So then why is mapping so important for Apple? Apple doesn't have an ads business in the way that Google does.
Right, so Apple doesn't really make money on Maps in terms of advertising, like you said, like Google might or Microsoft might. But Maps is a key platform, and basically Apple's bread and butter is selling iPhone hardware, making their margins, making their profits, and their revenues based on that. And having a really solid Maps platform might get some people to buy an iPhone. If people want to really call an Uber quickly through Maps, they do that a lot. People use OpenTable, Fandango, other applications. They're all linked into this new Maps platform they've been building. But it's also very sticky, too. If you're really integrated into the Maps platform, you're not going to have such an easy time moving to Android and Google Maps.
I think the actual, another really key element is not directly that you or I, as a consumer, would be using the Maps app itself, but to make it really appealing to developers.
Exactly.
And Craig Federighi made some comments, the Apple software chief basically, made some comments along these lines saying that they're trying to build out the apps product in order to get developers to build Apple Maps into their apps rather than Google Maps, and therefore it means it's specific to the iPhone. The more apps that you have on your iPhone, the less likely you are to turn it in for an Android device. And so, it's a kind of 2-stage effort to increase this stickiness, this lack of willingness to swap for another phone. We have a question here. Do we know the scale of Apple's drone operation? Well, we just sort of addressed that ever so slightly, namely that there are not so many just yet. We think it's a relatively small team doing this in the US so far, but we don't know the limits of it. It could go on any particular scale. And how much of a difference will a handful of drones make in terms of closing the gap with Google? That seems a pretty pertinent point.
It's not immediately going to make a dent, but it's showing that they're willing to try anything to improve their Apple Maps business. And drones, are very effective. They're very cheap. And let's say they put, 1,000 minivans on the road across the world to do data collection. A minivan could range anywhere, depending on kind of deals they're getting, between $10,000 and $30,000. Imagine all the people who are having to operate the minivans, building up the technology that gets stored in there, the gas flying it around. So if you could put 1,000 minivans on the road across the world, imagine how many drones you can put across the world. And obviously drones can move faster than minivans because you're not having traffic there. So there's a lot of different, good effects of having drones instead of minivans.
Does Google use drones to create their maps? How does their process work? I don't know for certain if Google uses drones. I'm pretty sure, though, that when they get like satellite photography data, or photography data more broadly, they often buy it from third parties, as far as I know, and those guys might be using drones.
Yeah, Google really has been the pioneer in the maps data collection space. They have, drones, they have robots, all sorts of stuff. They've even gone to Antarctica and the Arctic and taken photos there. But keep in mind, Google is 10 years ahead of Apple. We'll see where Apple goes in 5 years from now. Drones is just, one component of different ways to improve the data.
Well, one thing that I think is quite interesting in this whole topic is the fact that mapping is developing in a, when I say in a more digital way, I don't simply mean that there are maps on computers. The maps of the future, when we look at autonomous vehicles, are going to be computer-to-computer maps, in the sense that no human will necessarily ever look at this particular kind of map. It'll be a map which a computer understands to enable an autonomous vehicle to navigate a city, and the autonomous vehicle is, of course, also a computer. And so that is the huge push at the moment, and the kind of sensors that you're building into cars, I think there are probably limitations to the extent to which you can also build those into drones.
Right, and we have a question here about the privacy implications of flying around drones for maps data collection. I have 2 points on this. One, the FAA, sort of the regulatory body that manages drone flying for commercial uses, is making sure that, for the time being, that drones cannot be flight over people, over buildings, which sort of limits Apple's abilities for right now at the get-go of this project.
Or at least not without those buildings' permission.
Or permission. But in terms of Apple's data collection, I would say that it's very similar to what Apple is doing with minivans right now. Apple puts out a website and updates it every week with a schedule of when minivans are going to be driving in the neighborhood, so people have the ability to avoid it if they want to. They're very transparent about this. And they blur everything out in terms of people and license plates. So I think it's going to be the same deal with drones.
There was another element to the story that we had, namely that Apple is developing indoor mapping. There was an acquisition they made last year, a Finnish company called Indoor.io, which specializes in indoor mapping. Now, people use Google Maps. You already have this for a lot of buildings, shopping centers, and so on. And it seems that Apple is also developing a product in that space.
Right, so Apple's been working on indoor mapping for at least 3 years, very publicly. So if you are a giant mall, basically a place that gets 1 million people in foot traffic per year, you can sign up on Apple's website to be an indoor maps provider. You can submit your data. Apple, a few years ago, they started driving around like little, indoor mapping robots around its own campus to test these things, to really understand the insides of buildings. So now Apple Maps not only is helpful to you, if you consider it helpful, to walking down the street to get to a place, but it's also helpful for navigating to different stores within a mall. Maybe it's very useful in an airport if you're trying to navigate to your terminal. It's also very useful if you're trying to go in a museum and you're looking for a particular dinosaur.
And I mean, when you talk about usefulness there, you're talking about clearly the usefulness to the user.
Right.
On the flip side, if we're thinking about this idea of trying to incentivize developers to build apps which use Apple Maps, if you are a retailer, you want to be able to know where an individual might be in order that you can, push them towards your product. So, for example, if I were to have a well, it happens already now with TripAdvisor. If I give TripAdvisor the permission to see my location, often when I'm walking down the street, I will get an alert which says, did you know this place 20 yards from where you are sells great crepe? Now, doing that even more accurately inside a building, of course, advances the potential of that sort of thing. And
it's taking iBeacons, that technology, to the next level. So it's sort of like, if you walk into an Apple store and you walk up to the Mac table, it will have an iBeacon under the table. It's this little slim circular device, and it can light up your phone with tips and tricks about the new MacBook Pro.
Well, I think the thing's quite interesting now, though, is the hardware in the iPhone. It was iBeacon was this product using sort of Bluetooth and Wi-Fi technology to track your location inside a building, in a shopping center, and so on. And actually now there's a lot of technology already in the iPhone without requiring any sort of external hardware or additional external hardware, which lets you track your location relatively accurately. It's essentially three things. There's the Wi-Fi itself in any given building. So quite often it says, turn your Wi-Fi on. It will allow us to track your location or detect your location more accurately. But secondly, the chip in the iPhone which detects pressure, barometric pressure, can also detect what altitude you're at.
Exactly.
And that lets, in a shopping center, you see what floor you're on.
Exactly, and it could tell you, go up a floor, go down a floor, or take an elevator and such. But, the A8 chip in the iPhone 6, like Alex said, the hardware's already there. They added this in 2014, so there's tens of millions of people who'll be able to automatically use the pressure sensor to get the status of what floor they're on.
There are increasingly questions about the competition between Apple and Google. Now, namely, Google, as you say, has been in this space for a long time.
That's right.
And it has vast expertise in the ability, and also it's integrated very heavily with its database of businesses globally, which it uses for search and so on, and people then enter themselves their own location within Google Search, and of course then within Google Maps. And by say people, I mean businesses can do that.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't seem as though there's a terribly easy way for Apple to make up that ground at great pace.
I agree. It's been a long time, but Apple now has a website, and it's part of this Maps portal, the indoor map feature that I talked about. A store could basically update their phone number, add some images, integrate with different services, and it's not something that Apple really promotes. I think if they promoted it a bit better to businesses, they would have a bigger database of points of interest.
We have a question: is Apple planning to monetize its mapping services? I mean, as far as we can tell, no.
I mean, it would be very easy for them to do so in terms of asking Uber or OpenTable or Lyft for a cut or a very small percentage, sort of like what they do with Apple Pay, if you use Maps as the conduit to booking your reservation or your car. Apple Pay takes a percentage, obviously, so maybe they can better promote Apple Pay as the payment method through the Uber app within the Apple Maps app, which would automatically give them a cut without any extra negotiating work really needed.
It's a question of essentially integrating all the diverse products about Apple even further. The problem is, of course, Apple has killed its ads business. It did have iAds, and at the start of this year, or late last year, December, January, they shuttered that part of the business, moved that whole team into App Store search, which now there's promoted search within the App Store, as I'm sure some of you will have noticed. And so it's very hard for them to monetize their maps in the same way that Google does.
Right, and it's interesting because this team is not doing iAd anymore, but they're doing search ads, right? I feel like it could be easily applicable to the Maps app, having search ads in the Maps app.
There's another interesting point made here that Apple Maps at this stage are only available if you have an Apple device.
Right.
And why might a developer switch from Google to something for a selective ecosystem? And I think this is kind of the reason why they are trying to make Apple Maps so much better, because it's this very point that if their map product is that much better on iPhone, then a developer is more likely to use it for iPhone, and therefore the end consumer is more likely to buy a product which is from Apple, such as an iPhone.
Right, and there's your answer for anyone wondering if Apple's ever going to come out with Maps on the iPhone. As long as this remains a play to sell more iPhones, it's never going to happen.
Well, you mean if it's going to make a product for the internet?
For Android.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
For apple.com/maps or something
it's
like
possible, It's possible, but mobile's where it's at. They don't really. If they did an Apple Maps for the web, I think it would be exclusive to the desktop. Because right now, if you even try to go to the iCloud website on an iPhone, it pushes you to the apps. It doesn't work on Android. So I think if they do something like that, it would be pretty exclusive.
Well, I think that's probably enough for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. Hope to see you the same time next week, and wish you a lovely afternoon or morning, depending on where you are in the world.